There is a field outside Strasburg, Colorado, where the wheel tracks still show. Not tire tracks from a truck, circular tracks, cut into the dirt in a perfect ring nearly a quarter-mile across, worn in by 40 years of the same machine walking the same slow circle around the same fixed point. The soil inside that ring is dark and even. The soil just past the last wheel track, past where the water ever reached, is the pale, cracked, wind-scoured color of the shortgrass prairie it always was. A few hundred feet decide whether the ground grows wheat or grows nothing at all. The man who solved that problem lived down the road. He was not an engineer by training. He built the first working model out of pipe scrap and a farm truck's used parts, and by the time he was done, he had changed what a desert was allowed to mean.
His name was Frank Zybach. He farmed near Strasburg in Arapahoe County on the high, dry plains east of Denver, where the rainfall in a good year might reach 15 inches, and the wind took half of that back before it ever soaked in. Like every farmer on that stretch of the eastern Colorado plains in the years after the Dust Bowl, Zybach knew exactly what dry land did to a family. He had watched the topsoil leave in the wind. He had watched furrow irrigation, the old method, ditches cut by hand or mule, water walked down rows by gravity alone, waste more water than it delivered, pooling too deep at the near end of a field and never arriving at the far end at all. On uneven, sandy, rolling ground, the kind that made up most of the high plains, furrow irrigation didn't just waste water. It often couldn't be used at all. A ditch needs a consistent grade to carry water by gravity, and the high plains do not offer consistent grade. Whole sections of land, good soil sitting on good water, were simply unfarmable by any method a plains farmer had access to in the 1940s.
What Zybach built, sometime around 1948, was strange enough that his neighbors didn't have a word for it. A long pipe suspended above the crop on a line of wheeled towers, each tower moving independently but staying in line with the others, the whole assembly pivoting slowly around a fixed water source at the center of the field. A single arm, sometimes a quarter-mile long, sweeping a full circle every day or two, spraying water evenly along its entire length as it went. The genius of the design wasn't the sprinkler heads or the pipe itself. Sprinkler irrigation had existed for decades. The genius was solving the problem of keeping every tower moving at the same angular speed, so the line stayed straight as it swept its circle, tower after tower, mile after mile of uneven ground, without the line buckling or falling out of formation. Zybach worked that problem out largely on his own, welding and adjusting in his own.
He patented the idea in 1952. He called it, with the plain-spoken understatement of a man who did not yet know what he'd done, a self-propelled sprinkling irrigating apparatus. It is worth sitting with that name for a moment. He did not call it a revolution. He did not call it the end of the American desert. He called it what it was to him, a piece of equipment that moved itself and sprinkled water. The scale of what it would do to the map of the country was not yet visible from inside a Strasburg farm shop. Zybach didn't have the capital to manufacture it himself. He found a partner in A.E. Trowbridge, and together they took the patent to a small manufacturing outfit in Columbus, Nebraska, Valley Manufacturing Company, a firm that had been building truck bodies and farm implements out of a modest plant on the edge of town. Valley Manufacturing bought the rights and began building center pivots commercially starting in 1954. The machine that came off that line was not glamorous. It was gray-painted structural pipe on steel wheels, built to be functional in a way that no farmer would ever mistake for beautiful. There was no signature color the way a tractor brand had a signature color. No Persian orange, no Farmall red. A pivot's identity was never in how it looked sitting still. It was in the circle it left behind. But it did something no ditch, no furrow, and no hand-moved sprinkler line had ever done at scale. It put a measured, even skin of water over rolling, uneven, sandy ground that gravity-fed irrigation had always written off as unfarmable. For the first time, the limiting factor on whether a piece of high plains ground could grow row crops wasn't the shape of the land. It was whether you could get a well down to water and a pump strong enough to feed the line. What happened next was not a slow adoption curve. It was the single fastest transformation of marginal American land into cropland in the history of the country's agriculture. And it started in ground that most farmers and most bankers had already decided was worthless.
The ground everyone had written off was the Nebraska sandhills and the high plains, sitting on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest freshwater aquifers on Earth, stretching from South Dakota down through Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and into the Texas Panhandle. For decades, that water had sat underground, functionally useless to a farmer, because sandy, rolling, dune-like ground could not hold a straight irrigation ditch, and furrow irrigation on a slope that shifted every few hundred feet just meant water running off one field and drowning the next. The center pivot didn't care about the slope. It didn't care about the sand. It walked its circle regardless, and wherever a farmer could sink a well down into the Ogallala and get a pump running, that circle could turn desert pale rangeland into a quarter section of corn. By the mid-1960s, the classic machine of the golden era, Valley's own pivot lines, alongside newer entrants like Zematic and Lindsay, and later Reinke and TL Irrigation out of Kansas, had settled into a recognizable shape. Spans of roughly 150 to 200 feet between towers, a full system stretching a quarter mile from the pivot point, capable of covering somewhere close to 130 acres in a single perfect circle, running on electric or diesel-powered drive units at each tower that kept the whole line moving in unison. A basic system in the 1960s might run a farmer somewhere in the range of $15,000 to $25,000 installed. Real money for the time, often more than the tractor pulling the planter. But the corn that circle could grow, on ground that had never grown anything but grama grass, paid it back inside a handful of seasons. The adoption curve, once it started, moved faster than almost anything else in the history of American farm equipment. In the early 1960s, there were only a few hundred pivots turning across the whole country. By the early 1970s, there were tens of thousands. The reason was simple arithmetic. Land that had been worth grazing money, at best, was suddenly worth row crop money, and the difference in value per acre could be dramatic enough to pay off a well, a pump, and a full pivot system within a few good corn years. Farmers who ran the early machines described something almost bewildering about watching them work. One Nebraska panhandle grower, interviewed decades later for a regional agricultural oral history project, recalled walking out at 2 a.m. just to watch his own pivot crawl past under a full moon, water fanning out behind it in a slow silver arc, over ground his father had grazed cattle on because nobody believed you could grow anything else there. He said it looked like farming had learned to walk. Another account, drawn from a Kansas State University Extension oral history of Sandhills irrigation, described a family that had run cattle on native rangeland for 3 generations before installing their first pivot in 1968. The grower recalled that his own father refused to believe corn would grow on that ground until he stood at the edge of the circle in August and watched the tassels move in the wind. Ground he had grazed steers on his whole life, now taller than a man, green in a season that would otherwise have burned the grass down to nothing. He said his father never fully trusted the machine, but he never once shut it off either. And you can still see the shape of what those machines built from the air. Fly over the Nebraska Panhandle, or western Kansas, or the Texas Panhandle today, and the land isn't laid out in the square-mile grid the rest of the Midwest follows. It's laid out in circles, hundreds of thousands of green circles inside brown squares, each one the fingerprint of a single pivot, still turning. Satellite images of the region, the kind now easily pulled up on any mapping app, show it better than words can. A patchwork that looks almost designed, an accidental art project drawn by a machine that was only ever trying to solve one man's problem on one field outside Strasburg, Colorado. There is a set of USGS water level records for the High Plains that most people outside the region have never looked at. The story those records tell is not a story about a machine failing. It is a story about a machine succeeding for too long,
on a resource nobody was measuring closely enough. The center pivot did not fall the way a tractor brand falls. No factory closure, no bankruptcy filing, no single collapse year. Valley Manufacturing is still building irrigation equipment in Valmont Industries today. Zematic, Lindsay, Reinke, and TL are still selling pivots across the same ground. The machine did not disappear. What changed was the ground beneath it.
The Ogallala Aquifer, in large stretches of Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma, does not recharge at anything close to the rate it is being pumped. The aquifer formed over millions of years, fed by sediment washing down from the ancient Rocky Mountains. And in most of the region, annual recharge from rainfall is a tiny fraction of what a single season of center pivot irrigation draws out. Decades of center pivot irrigation, drawing on wells sunk into a body of water that in places took thousands of years to accumulate, have measurably lowered the water table. In some Texas Panhandle counties by well over 100 feet since large-scale irrigation began. USGS survey data has tracked parts of the southern high plains where the saturated thickness of the aquifer has fallen so far that irrigation wells that once ran strong now struggle to keep a single pivot supplied. And some wells across the southern half of the aquifer's range have gone dry outright, retired not because the pivot above them broke, but because the water beneath them ran out.
The irony sits at the center of the whole story. The machine that let farmers stop depending on unreliable rainfall made them entirely dependent on a groundwater supply that, unlike rain, does not renew itself on a human timescale. A river can flood and refill. Rain can come back next year. The deep Ogallala water pumped up under a pivot in the Texas Panhandle, once it's gone, is functionally gone for a span of time longer than any farm's ownership will last. Alongside the water table pressure came the same economic weather every part of American agriculture felt in the 1980s. Between 1981 and 1986, over 300,000 American farms went through foreclosure. Commodity prices collapsed. Interest rates that had peaked near 21% left heavily leveraged operations, and a center pivot system, financed like a piece of heavy machinery, was exactly the kind of debt that turned lethal, unable to service what they owed. Farmers who had drilled a well and financed a pivot on the promise of Ogallala water sometimes found themselves owing on a machine irrigating a well that could no longer keep up with it. A pivot bought on credit in the late 1970s, at the height of grain prices and land values, could become, within 5 years, a piece of financed steel standing over a well pumping less water every season, on ground whose value had fallen along with the crop prices it was supposed to grow.
The two pressures compounded each other in a way that neither one alone would have. A farm with a healthy well and a bad debt load could often survive by selling ground or renegotiating terms. A farm with manageable debt but a failing well had fewer options. You cannot renegotiate with an aquifer. When both pressures hit the same operation at once, in the same decade, across the same stretch of the southern plains, the result was a slow-motion sorting of which circles would keep turning and which would eventually go quiet. In parts of the Texas Panhandle today, county extension agents can point to circles from the air that no longer turn green in July. Pivots still standing, wells still there, water no longer sufficient to run them the way they were built to run. The machine outlived the resource it depended on. Columbus, Nebraska, the town where Valley Manufacturing built the first commercial pivots, never became a ghost town the way an auto plant town might. Valmont Industries, Valley's descendant company, is still headquartered there, still manufacturing irrigation equipment and steel structures, still one of the town's major employers. That's the strange thing about this particular story. The company that built the machine never really fell. But drive west from Columbus, out across the Nebraska Panhandle and into eastern Colorado and western Kansas, and the aftermath is written on the ground instead. Some counties over the Ogallala have moved to mandatory metering and pumping restrictions in the last 2 decades, trying to slow a decline that outran anyone's early expectations. Some circles that were broken out of native rangeland in the 1960s and 70s have, in dry years, been quietly returned to grass, not because the pivot failed, but because the well beneath it could no longer be trusted to keep a full circle of corn alive through August. The machine that turned desert into farmland did not go away. What went away, in places, was the water it was built to spread.
Somewhere tonight on the Nebraska Panhandle, a pivot is making its slow circuit under a summer sky, exactly the way one did the night that unnamed farmer walked out to watch his own machine in the moonlight. The machine still works. The question the whole region is still answering, year by year, well by well, is how much longer the water underneath it will let it.
Frank Zybach did not set out to change the geography of half a continent. He set out to solve a problem on one dry field outside Stroudsburg, Colorado. What he built instead was the single machine most responsible for turning the American High Plains, ground the earliest surveyors labeled on their maps the Great American Desert, into some of the most productive farmland on the planet. That is not a small thing to have done with pipe scrap and a patent filed in 1952.
But every circle of green corn cut into brown rangeland was drawn with water that took millennia to gather underground, and that no machine, however elegant, can put back once it's spent. The center pivot did not fail the way a factory fails. It succeeded so completely, for so long, that it outran the one resource it could never manufacture. That is the real story here. Not a company, not a patent. The water, and what it cost to prove a desert wrong. If your family ever ran a pivot, if you grew up watching that same slow circle turn outside your own kitchen window, the next story is one you'll want to hear.